Felipe Massa is often known as the Formula 1 champion for just 30 seconds, having lost out to the title to Lewis Hamilton in 2008 by just 1 point in Brazil. The Brazilian did, however, have an illustrious career that spanned over 2 decades and also 3 separate eras of Formula 1. But it was his time in Ferrari against Fernando Alonso that really put his career under the spotlight. So exactly how good was Felipe Massa against Fernando Alonso? Now, this is the second video in a long extended series that I'll be running, comparing all of the teammates together that I can in order to create an interconnecting web of teammate connections for race pace, in order to predict and project different teammate outcomes. If you would like to check out video number 1, which was Mark Webber against Sebastian Vettel, I'll leave that video in a card in the corner. But without further ado, let us take a look at the methodology of today's video, as that is exceptionally important. There is a 5-step process that I've created for all of these statistics. It starts with driver A and driver B set lap times for an entire Grand Prix. In this example, there are 20 laps. Step number 1 is to remove the first lap, any VSC laps, any safety car laps, any red flag laps, any pit stops, and any slow laps. These laps are then identified and highlighted in red, and then they are removed as follows, making sure that the same order of laps is maintained. Step number 2 is to identify just the clean air laps when the cars were not stuck in traffic. These laps are highlighted in green, and we will be keeping these laps and discarding everything else and moving on to step number 3. Step number 3, after identifying the clean air laps from the list, is to remove the fastest 10% and the slowest 30% of the remaining laps. By doing this, we end up pulling the overall middle range of lap times. The laps that we are removing are once again highlighted in red, and we move on in to step number 4. And in order to make a very fair and direct comparison between driver A and driver B, step number 4 is to identify the laps that were set on the same lap of the Grand Prix. That is why it is imperative to keep the same lap time order, and those laps that will be selected are highlighted in green. For this example, there are 3. And with these 3 laps, we move on into step number 5. And we can see that the overall race of 20 laps has been whittled down to 3 that we will compare. And generally, every single race distance is whittled down by about 70%. Sometimes it is more. And then step number 5 is to calculate the percentage difference between these final laps that we have done. The percentage difference is calculated by doing 1 minus driver A's lap time divided by driver B's lap time multiplied by 100, where a positive value will be advantage towards driver A and a negative value will be advantage towards driver B. And for these 3 lap times selected after going through the 5-step process, we end up with these differences here, which we can then directly average out together to end up with an overall average for the whole Grand Prix of minus 0.05% per lap, where this advantage is in favour of driver B. Where 0.05% is roughly half a tenth for the long extended tracks like Spa, Singapore and Malaysia, and around 300ths at tracks like Monaco, Austria and Canada. And with that methodology all concluded, we will now take a look at Felipe Massa versus Fernando Alonso, and we will take a look at their first season as teammates in 2010. And for these 2 drivers, we end up with a graph that looks a little bit like this. Felipe Massa will be in the blue and Fernando Alonso will be in the red, with the 0 line highlighted in the red horizontal. If we can map on all of the races that have been included, we get a graph that looks something like this. So for the 2010 season, there were 11 out of 19 races counted, with Singapore and Japan being excluded because Felipe Massa did not have enough clean air laps to be selected. Then Europe and Abu Dhabi were excluded because there were no lap times set on the same lap after the truncation period. And then Australia, China, Belgium and Korea were all excluded because they were raining races. And averaging out these 11 points, we end up with an advantage in favour of Fernando Alonso of just 0.16% overall. There were 7 races ahead for Fernando Alonso compared to 4 for just Felipe Massa, where 0.16% roughly equates to just over a tenth of a second at Monaco, Austria and Canada, and just over 1.5 tenths at Spa, Singapore and Malaysia. So as first seasons go as a teammate pairing, you would expect the long-standing Ferrari man of Felipe Massa to perhaps be a little bit closer, if not ahead, of the incoming Fernando Alonso. However, it can be equally argued that the two-time Formula 1 world champion, looking for glory in red, could have put a little bit more of an advantage over the Brazilian. But from 2010, we will now take a look at 2011. And 2011 was much more of a slam dunk year for Fernando Alonso. He absolutely dominated, where there were just 14 out of 19 races that were counted, and none of the 14 races counted was Felipe Massa ever faster. Australia and Monaco were both excluded as they were in favour of Fernando Alonso by 5+%. This is completely unrealistic in order to obtain an average, with Canada, Britain and also Hungary being excluded because they were rainy races. And averaging out this year, we can see that Alonso had an average pace advantage per lap of 0.69%. This is absolutely phenomenal pace, where he was ahead for all 14 races that were counted and 0 for Felipe Massa, where 0.69% equates to almost half a second at Monaco, Austria and Canada, and close to 0.7 at Spa, Singapore and Malaysia. So it can definitely be argued that 2011 was a downturn for Felipe Massa against that battle with Fernando Alonso, where we have one driver fighting for the World Championship against the 2 Red Bulls, and then we have one driver that is struggling to even maintain podium finishing positions. But from 2011, we will now take a look at 2012, their 3rd season as teammates at Ferrari, where the 2012 graph looks a little something like this. Mapping it on, we can see that once again Alonso has a significant advantage, but at least Felipe Massa was able to claw back some of the races, unlike 2011. Where this season there were 15 out of 20 races counted, with Belgium and Japan being excluded because there were not enough clean air laps to analyse for Fernando Alonso. Monaco was excluded because neither driver set lap times on the same lap after the truncation period, with Malaysia and Brazil being excluded for being rainy races. And averaging out all of these points, we end up with an advantage for Fernando Alonso of just 0.41%. Nowhere near as significant as his whitewash year of 2011, but considerably faster than their first year as teammates in 2010, where there were 11 races ahead for Fernando Alonso and just 4 once again for Felipe Massa, where 0.41% roughly equates to 0.3 at Monaco, Austria and Canada, and just over 4 at Spa, Singapore and Malaysia. So 2012 was a far better year for Felipe Massa at Ferrari when he was partnered with Fernando Alonso. Nothing compared to his first year in 2010, but considerably better than 2011. However, what plagued their partnership was the absolute toxicity that was Ferrari's team orders, favouring Fernando Alonso in literally every single circumstance, and almost disregarding completely Felipe Massa's races. But from 2012, we move on into their final year as teammates, 2013. Where the 2013 graph looks a little something like this. We can map it on and we can see that once again for the majority of the races this year, Fernando Alonso has a significant advantage. However, in Bahrain, Felipe Massa was able to put in a storming performance, but just 1 for that season, where there were 14 out of 19 races counted overall, with Monaco, Germany and Korea all being excluded for Felipe Massa not having enough clean air laps to analyse. Canada was also excluded because it was an outlier race overall, and then Malaysia was excluded because it was a rainy race. And averaging out all of these points for the 2013 season, we have an average pace advantage for Fernando Alonso of 0.36%. He was faster for 13 out of the 14 counted races, where Massa was just faster for 1. And 0.36% roughly equates to 2.5 tenths at Monaco, Austria and Canada, and just over 3.5 tenths at Spa, Singapore and Malaysia. So it was clear at this point in 2013 that Massa was not able to match the pace of Fernando Alonso, whether that was all down to the shenanigans of the teammate orders or whether it was a genuine inherent pace disadvantage. And it was this year that Felipe Massa ended up leaving Ferrari after being with the team for such a long period of time, and he moved on to new pastures with Williams. But what we can do now is we can take the 4 main values at the end of each of the seasons and we can plot them onto one overall graph to see how dominant each driver was, and mapping them on, we can see it looks a little bit like this. So 2010 was the season where both drivers were the closest, and then it massively expanded up to 2011, where it slowly began to come back down as each of the pairings came a little bit closer. And over this 4-year span, there were 54 out of 77 races that were counted, where there were 5 races not included due to Felipe Massa not having enough clean air laps to analyse, and 4 for Fernando Alonso. There were 10 rainy races overall, 3 races where neither driver set lap times on the same lap after the truncation period, and there were 3 anomalous races. And averaging out these 4 percentage values in favour of Fernando Alonso, we end up with a value of just 0.4% across this 4-year period, where there were 42 races ahead for the Spaniard compared to just 12 for Felipe Massa overall, where 0.4% roughly equates to just under 0.3 at Monaco, Austria and Canada, and just over 0.4 at Spa, Singapore and Malaysia. So it was overall a fairly significant gap between the 2 teammates across the 4 years at Ferrari. But what we can do now is we can take a look at the overall database that I've so far created, which consists of just the 2 driver pairings at the moment. Those are Mark Webber versus Sebastian Vettel and Fernando Alonso versus Felipe Massa that we have just looked at. And those values are on screen. So Alonso versus Massa was in favour of Alonso by 0.4% like we just looked at, and Vettel versus Webber was 0.16% in favour of the German. And that brings us to the end of the video comparing Felipe Massa against Fernando Alonso as their time as teammates at Ferrari. If there are any questions that you have regarding today's video or just any queries whatsoever, please let me know in the comments down below and I'll do my best to answer them. If there are equally any other driver pairings that you would like to make suggestions for the future, please let me know also in the comments down below. But that is all I've got for you today, guys. I hope you have enjoyed, and I will catch you in the next episode with whatever and whenever I decide to make it. I'll see you guys then.